Okay, so I'm going to talk to you this evening about my book Longbourn. And what I'm going to do is talk a bit, to start with, about how the book came to be written. And because it's quite an unusual book, because it's in conversation with Austen's existing novel. Then I'm going to talk about how the book works, because it's got this very particular structure because of the way in which it interacts with that other book. And then I'm going to talk a bit about how the research came together to write the book. But alongside that, I'm going to give some little readings to kind of illustrate what I'm saying. But before I get started, I'd just like, if you don't mind, a brief show of hands. Who here's read it already? Okay, a smattering, I'd call that. Has anyone here started it but not got... Yeah, okay, that's an even smaller smattering. So, a few months ago, I was doing one of these events in London, in a little parish hall in London for Dulwich Bookshop, a lovely independent bookstore. And anyway, that's by the by, but I was talking, and it was the end of the session, and people were asking questions. And one woman started sort of describing major swathes of the plot, talking about various things that happened towards the end of the novel. And another woman towards the back of the room let out this great wail of anguish, because she had read about 15 pages, enough to know who was being spoken about, who the main characters were, enough to know what mattered in the book. And she was just really appalled that she'd had these big plot points given away. Until that point, it hadn't occurred to me that that would ever be a problem, but it clearly was a problem for her. And so, as I speak, I'm going to be careful not to give away too much. And if at the end, when it comes to asking questions, if you too could be careful about not giving things away that other people might not want to know just yet, just out of courtesy. And then if there's stuff that you want to raise with me, please do so. Just, grab me afterwards, and I'm happy to chat about things on a one-to-one level in a way that won't upset anyone, because I don't want to hear that wail of anguish again. So, how Longbourn came to be written. It's been a long gestation, this one, a kind of elephant pregnancy for this book, really. I'm a lifelong fan of Austen. I first read her books when I was 12. At first, and I think it says in the acknowledgements here that I can't remember when I read Austen. I've actually remembered since then. It came to me, and I was sitting on a tram in Manchester, and I'd just done a radio show there, and I'd been asked that question. I sort of went, I don't know, I can't remember. And then in the tram on the way home, I did remember, a little bit too late, really. But it was when I was 12, and we were streamed at high school. So we were put in level of ability, and I ended up sitting next to the same girl for almost everything, apart from maths, because she was much better at maths than I was. And that's when I first got to know her, and her name was Emma. And she told me then that she'd been named Emma after Emma, from Emma. And I just looked at her, puzzled, and probably said something along the lines of, what? But she explained about Austen's novels, and was pretty much appalled that I wasn't reading them yet. I was 12. But that's when I started. And I've been rereading them ever since. And I reach for those books, as I think lots of us do, on a regular basis, but also at times of challenge, of difficult times, like exam stress when I was a kid, or moving house, or moving country, having babies, late feeds in the middle of the night with a Pride and Prejudice propped up on one side. I even took Pride and Prejudice into hospital in my labour bag, which goes to show you how little I knew about anything, really. But also what a comfort blanket that book is for me. And I think for a lot of people, it's a kind of duvet and a box of chocolates kind of book. But I've always felt, however much I love that world, and however much I love losing myself in that world, that I don't quite belong in it. My family were in service until quite recently. They worked as maids in houses in and around London. So this would be my mum's mum and her sisters, and before that as well, but most recently my mum's mum and her sisters. And I've always known this, and part of the reason I've always known it is because we've always had little bits and pieces around our house from that time. Gifts that they were given by the master. So a few little bits of old silver cutlery or some, incomplete dinner services with the chinas all crazed with cracks and gone a bit grey. In fact, it wasn't all the sisters who got given these presents. It was only one of them, my great Aunt Sue. And it was always said of her, I don't know if this expression works here or not, but it was always said of her that she was no better than she should be. Obviously that works here, yeah. Because none of the other sisters ever got given anything, so they always speculated that, and it's too late for me to find out because they're all dead now, but either she was stealing things, so she, there's quite small things that you could maybe slip under an apron or down a boot or up a sleeve, or she was carrying on with the master. We don't know, and as I said, it's too late to find out, but Aunt Sue was considered a bit rakish in her behaviour. So there was that. There's just this sort of sense of loving that world, but knowing that funnily enough, it's a strange thing to admit as a writer, but what there is really there is a failure of imagination on my part. However much I love Austen, I can't quite imagine myself in Elizabeth Bennet's boots. I'd been much more likely to be cleaning them. And that was what I remember feeling about when I was reading these books. This love, this sense of slight displacement. And also a sense, I think, of there being other people in the room. Being aware that, like, when a message was delivered, someone must have brought that message. Or when a carriage was brought round, that means someone's driving that carriage. Or when a meal is served, someone must have cooked it. And I think I was just a bit alert to that because of that family connection. And that's probably as far as it would have gone. That's rereading and still rereading Austen, loving it, but still feeling that slight strangeness about it. If I hadn't got stuck on one particular line in Pride and Prejudice, just one of those many rereadings, no different from any other, and I just got stuck. And I remember staring at the text, because mostly when you're reading a book you're enjoying, you don't notice the words, they get in your brain and they do their magic. But there I was just looking at this line of print, thinking, what does that mean? What does that really, literally mean? And it's in the lead up to the Netherfield ball, and it's been raining for days, and the roads are awash, and the footpaths are deep with mud, and there's no way the Bennet girls are going to venture forth. And so, and this is the line from Austen, the very shoe roses for Netherfield were got by proxy. And I thought, who's proxy? And I thought, how does she feel? And very soon it became she, and very soon it became associated with Sarah, who is the one housemaid who actually gets given a name in Pride and Prejudice. So how does she or Sarah feel about going out in this terrible weather to fetch shoe roses? Many of you probably know this, but they're little decorations that go, they're sort of like pom-poms, flowers, that kind of thing, that go on the front of your dancing shoes, so when they peep out from underneath your frock, they look pretty. So how does she feel about going out to collect decorations for other women's dancing shoes so that they can go and enjoy themselves at a ball that she can't possibly hope ever to attend? She describes it as like being a mermaid's tea party. She cannot enter that element. And really, the whole of this book, well, it looks more impressive in hardback. It doesn't look that big, but the whole of this book came out of that one line in Pride and Prejudice and thinking about how does that proxy feel about her situation in life, about how she's obliged to live, how does she experience the world? And after doing quite a lot of research about servants' lives, the domestic world, that kind of thing, and a lot of daydreaming, and a lot of picking away at the text of Pride and Prejudice as well, this is what I came up with for how Proxy lives her life and feels about it. So this is Sarah. There could be no wearing of clothes without their laundering, just as surely as there could be no going without clothes, not in Hertfordshire anyway, and not in September. Wash day could not be avoided, but the weekly purification of the household's linen was nonetheless a dismal prospect for Sarah. The air was sharp at 4:30 in the morning when she started work. The iron pump handle was cold, and even with her mitts on, her chilblains flared as she heaved the water up from the underground dark and into her waiting pail. a long day to be got through, and this just the very start of it. All else was stillness. Sheep huddled in drifts on the hillside. Birds in the hedgerows were fluffed like thistledown. In the woods, fallen leaves rustled with the passage of a hedgehog. The stream caught starlight and glistened over rocks. Below, in the barn, cows huffed clouds of sweet breath, and in the sty the sow twitched, her piglets bundled at her belly. Mrs. Hill and her husband, up high in their tiny attic, slept the black, blank sleep of deep fatigue. 2 floors below, in the principal bedchamber, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet were a pair of churchyard humps under the counterpane. The young ladies, all 5 of them sleeping in their beds, were dreaming of whatever it was that young ladies dream, and over it all, icy starlight shone. It shone on the slate roofs and the flagged yard and the necessary house and the shrubbery and the little wilderness off to the side of the lawn, and on the coveys where the pheasants huddled, and on Sarah, one of the 2 Longbourn housemaids, who cranked the pump and filled a bucket and rolled it aside, her palms already sore, and then set another bucket down to fill it too. Over the eastern hills, the sky was fading to a transparent indigo. Sarah, glancing up, hands stuffed into her armpits, her breath clouding the air, dreamed of the wild places beyond the horizon where it was already fully light, and of how, when her day was over, the sun would be shining on other places still, on the Barbados and Antigua and Jamaica, where the dark men worked half naked, and on the Americas, where the Indians wore almost no clothes at all, and where there was, consequently, very little in the way of laundry, and how one day she would go there and never have to wash other people's underthings again. It's funny to be here reading that, actually, on the other side of the horizon as far as she's concerned. So you can see what I conceived of for that proxy. She's someone who, in the course of the day is up to her elbows in dirty water and soap suds, but she's someone who's already got her eyes fixed on the horizon and is wondering about what's beyond it. And you can also see from that section, or at least I can see from that section, and I think anyone who knows Pride and Prejudice well can see from that section, part of how the novel's going to work in general, the way that I light on those different locations within the book. I think everyone probably remembers the little wilderness off to the side of the lawn where Lady Catherine will eventually tackle Elizabeth over her supposed engagement to Mr. Darcy, and the coveys that Mr. Bingley is invited to come and shoot the birds at. And alongside that, my gaze lighting on these different places like the flagged yard and the barn and the necessary house, things that were there but weren't spoken of, the imagination didn't light on those things. And I should find my other notes. I'm skipping ahead. And that is part of how the book works. It begins before Austen's initiating incident of the arrival of the Bingleys, famously at Netherfield Park. And it continues on a little bit beyond Austen's happy ending. I hope that's not a spoiler for anyone. It keeps on going a little bit beyond that. But where they overlap, my book is mapped closely onto Austen's novel, so that when a meal is served in Pride and Prejudice, we've seen it prepared in the kitchen in Longbourn. And when the carriage is brought round or ordered in Pride and Prejudice, we've seen James run to harness up the horses in Longbourn. And when a message is delivered in Pride and Prejudice, that little hot-pressed piece of paper with the elegant Miss Bingley's handwriting on it, it's come all the way along the lanes and through the fields and up the path to Longbourn House. And obviously a messenger must be there to bring it. And I remember when the book was first sold, I came down to London to meet with my Canadian publisher. I'd never met her before, and she was a very important person in Canadian publishing, and I was very nervous. And I went all the way to London, where she was over for the London Book Fair, and she took me out for breakfast. We were talking about the book, and I said, so if you're a complete nerd, you could read it, my book there, and Austen's book there, and follow a character out of a room and into a room there. And she said, yes, I know, I've done that. How do you retreat from that? I nerd in a good way. But yes, that should be how the book works. And I realised around this time that the book was sort of beginning to be published and spoken of, and people were saying prequels, sequels, you know, all this kind of thing, I realised that this book is neither a prequel or a sequel. It's not before, it's not after. It's a subquel. It's what goes on below the other story. It's what's going on underneath that other story. And it's not just what's going on below. It's not that Pride and Prejudice is kind of noises off that have little to do with what's going on downstairs. The events of Pride and Prejudice exert an influence and apply pressure to my characters. And I thought that I would read now for you a little bit to illustrate the way in which the book works as this subquel thing that I've described it as. And in terms of the story, without giving anything too great away to those who don't know it yet, at this point in the book, maybe about a third of the way through, I don't know if you can see that, Sarah's in the doghouse with Mrs. Hill. She's in trouble. Nothing major, just like, you know, she's been carrying on a bit. That's all you really need to know. Excuse me. If I was more efficient, I'd have all this on an iPad or something, but instead I've got like little scrappy bits of paper and pencil marks and stuff. How's the sound at the back? You doing okay? Good. In the grey light of day, Mrs. Hill understood that she must find a way around this. A way of dealing with Sarah that was not head-on, but that slipped instead round the edge of her stubbornness and into the sweet and giving nature it defended. But even as Mrs. Hill was thinking this, she was scolding the girl, saying she'd better lift her chin up before she tripped on it. The only reply she got was a long look and a stiffening of the shoulders and a clattering down of dishes. I expect a civil answer when I speak to you. Speak civilly to me, missus, and you should get one. Mrs. Hill's jaw dropped. She was about to step cleanly over the brink of her temper, but then James pushed in through the hall door, and she saw herself as she must appear to him, a bitter, frowning old scold, and she clamped her mouth shut. She would say something kind instead, something soothing and considerate that would reconcile her with the girl, if she could but think what. Her efforts to summon something up were broken by a flurry of activity overhead. They heard the breakfast room door flung open and then slammed, and then a race of light footsteps down the hallway and up the stairs, one of the girls running to her bedchamber. Then more footsteps, heavier, going the opposite way to the first, Mrs. Bennet's. She was heading to the breakfast room. In the kitchen, the four of them stood stone still, heads cocked. James, on the threshold, pushed the door a little wider. "What is it?" Polly asked. "What's going on?" "It'll be Mr. Collins," Sarah said. "He'll have gone and proposed." Polly was agog. "Who to?" "Elizabeth." "Really?" "Shh." Mrs. Hill and Sarah moved to stand by James. Polly crept up too, and then Mr. Hill shambled over to join them in the doorway, shaking his head. They listened to the low burr of voices. "What are they saying?" Sarah put her finger to her lips. They heard the breakfast room door flung open again, and then Mrs. Bennet's footsteps pounding down the hallway. She passed into their line of sight. They shrank, Polly ducking low, Mr. Hill stepping back, Sarah squeezing in behind James, and Mrs. Hill turning completely away back into the kitchen. "I never knew she could move so fast," Polly said. They saw her throw open the library door. Polly made big eyes at Sarah. She hadn't even knocked. "Oh, Mr. Bennet, you are wanted immediately." Mrs. Bennet pulled the door shut behind her, cutting off the noise. James took his weight off their own door and let it fall closed. Sarah went back to the table, lifted the dishes. "Poor fellow, poor fool," James said. Mrs. Hill shook her head. "What an awful shame. Mary would have had him." Sarah headed for the scullery. Then the library bell jangled. They stopped to watch it dance there on its spring. "I'll go," said James. "No," said Mr. Hill, "they'll want Miss Lizzie fetching down, so—" "I'll go," Sarah said. Mrs. Hill stepped back to let her pass. This was a disaster, and it hit her like a horse's kick. Now he might marry anybody. Who knew what little ninny with a head full of fashionable nonsense he might pick up at Bath or Bristol or Canterbury or wherever it was that clergymen went looking for their wives. But if, as Sarah had said, Mary might have him, could snag him, they would be so safe with her. Mary would not want novelty simply for novelty's sake. With Mary in charge, the world below stairs would be as secure as anything in this world could hope to be. So the thing there, of course, is that when Mr. Bennet dies, Mr. Collins will inherit. So it really matters downstairs in a slightly different way who that is. Whether or not it's a Bennet girl, he can decide to keep the same staff on, or he can decide to bring in new people. So the idea of having someone there who will want, to start things afresh rather than continue with the existing staff is nerve-wracking for Mrs. Hill, keen as she is to maintain a level of security in what is a very unstable world at this time. And you can see, I think, from the way that scene works, that very famous scene, the proposal scene that we don't actually see, but we see the sort of the spillover out of the door, the way the book works, and the way in which my research must have begun, because it started with a very close reading of Pride and Prejudice. It started with a pencil and an edition of Pride and Prejudice, and shamefully, me destroying that copy, really, with working out who's in the room and who could be supposed to be in the room, really. If a message has been delivered, there must be a messenger. If a carriage is called for, then someone has to run and get it. Those silent presences, those unspoken figures who are there but aren't spoken of. And then things like what day of the week it is and what's for dinner. And making copious notes alongside that. As well as that, excuse me one moment. And this is when I reveal how shaky my hands are, excuse me. As well as that close reading, there's a sort of series of different kinds of research. I'm going to have to put this down again now as well, sorry. That were involved. Some of which were more sort of formal than others, and I'll just take you through the different elements, really. I was really lucky, just, by chance, the point when I started writing this book, there had been a series of really excellent histories done by some British academics, possibly here as well. I mean, it might just be that there is this resurgence in this particular area, this interest in the domestic world and in ordinary lives. So people like Amanda Vickery, who you might know from the Netherfield Ball reenactment, which I think is quite popular generally. I think they're going to be showing it at various Jane Austen Society events in the country here. But she writes on servants' lives, on the domestic world, on women's experience, and she does so brilliantly. And there's another woman called Karen Steadman whose work kind of overlaps and is of a similar kind of interest. And I was able to use both their work, and I've heard from both of them since that they've both loved this book. So if I could possibly get a sticker to go on the front, but it doesn't seem my publishers are keen to do that. Amongst others, there are others as well, but those particular two historians were of particular help to me. Alongside that, just using contemporary letters and recipes and remedies. Austen's own letters are a wonderful resource. They were a wonderful resource for me in terms of they're not considered very literary because they're all full of sort of domestic detail and gossip, and you bought me those gloves, so I owe you 3 and 6, but then you bought me that lace, so you owe, that kind of exchange with Cassandra and, chat about her niece's novel and how that's progressing. And it all feels very unliterary, but is actually a wonderful resource in terms of what life was actually like for her at that time and the kinds of things they bought and how they had their teeth done and that kind of thing. I also did some more sort of hands-on research alongside that kind of paper-based kind of stuff, so trying out recipes and things like this, and cleaning methods. Who knew how helpful cold tea could be? There's this method of cleaning floors where you just scatter around damp tea leaves and it lays the dust. This, before you had a vacuum cleaner, people used to do this all the time. I remember saying to my dad all this thing about, not just the tea leaves, but also cold tea on wooden floors. And he used to go to race meets with his dad, who was a cyclist when he was a kid. And he said, yeah, the ladies there would just slop out the teapots across the floor at the end of tea. And these things sort of get forgotten, and sometimes it's useful to just sort of pause and remember them. Because, you know, it's completely free, this stuff, and it's mildly antiseptic, and it brings up wooden floors a treat. I remember when I was trying these things out, and I was walking around the house, scattering tea leaves willy-nilly around the house, and my son was staring at me as if I'd gone mad. You're making it dirtier, Mum. But it really does work. So that's your top tip for the evening. That's the take-home message, really, here. Tea leaves on the floors. I've never tried it on a white carpet, so I make no promises there. But alongside that, there was a sort of element to the research that I didn't know was research at the time at all. And one thing I really like about this book is, when I've been sort of unpicking it, thinking about it, talking about it, is I've realized how much it's based in some of my oldest friendships. There's Emma, who was named Emma after Emma from Emma, and there's my friend Ruth, who was the vicar's daughter in the village where I grew up, a little village in the north of England called Arkholm. And the village is very pretty and very quiet and, you know, just a sweet little village in the north of England. But it had a Georgian vicarage. And at that time, the village was kind of in a sort of slump economically, if you will, and the vicarage had had no money spent on it for ages. And so the kitchen was this kind of big echoing room with a couple of modern appliances plugged in, you know, an electric stove and a fridge kind of thing. And outside that, there was the stable yard, even though the vicar drove a minibus, not a coach and horses. You had to get the choir around, you know, somehow. And then all the outbuildings were still there. And then effectively, they'd closed the doors on them when they became obsolete. And the only people who opened the doors on them afterwards were the kids playing out. And we used to play out there all the time. You know, out in the gardens that were kind of neglected and overgrown, but still had the basic layout from when it was a sort of functioning kitchen garden and formal garden as well. And into the little outhouses and stores and things. And even the necessary house was still there, though thankfully not in use. And it was a row of planks, a plank with a row of holes in it, rather, and a drop below. And then when you went round into the other part of the garden, there was a big door, like a normal-sized door, where someone would have to come and shovel it out. And that was still there when I was a kid, you know. And the stables were still there, though obviously empty because of the minibus. And a ladder at the back of the stables, and we weren't supposed to go up into the stable loft because the floor wasn't safe. And I think I realized that some of the kind of forbiddenness, the forbidden nature of the stable loft, it didn't stop us going up, we just weren't supposed to. But that sort of quality of like forbiddenness about that room, that sunlit attic, has strayed into Longbourn in a slightly different way. So I'm going to read you a little bit that, for me, captures Arkholm Vicarage before it was revamped. It has been tarted up now, and the outbuildings are now another dwelling, and you can still see the ghost of it, but it's not the same. It's much nicer, really, but it's not the same. Oh, and sorry, so this is actually earlier in the book than the previous section, and just in terms of story context, Sarah hasn't met the new manservant, James, yet. She is dying to. So that's what's going on in story terms. In terms of the historical context, one thing that she talks about is how, you know, everyone's very excited to get this new man about the house. It's not purely because she's interested in young men. It's also because of a particular sort of quirk of history at this time. Okay, so Napoleonic Wars are happening. The country is blockaded. There's minimal trade. Britain has to be self-sufficient. It also has to defend itself and pursue a war overseas. So, young men, well, the government doesn't really want them standing around serving soup. What they want is them to be working on the land, or to be in the navy, or to be in the army or the militia, the regulars or the militia. So they slap a big tax on keeping male servants. You can keep them. You already have to pay them more than your female servants. Nothing changes. But then you also have to pay this big tax on top of that. The idea being then that they will then, be freed to work on the land or in the forces. The unintended consequence of this was that having male servants became enormously fashionable because it showed how wealthy you were. If you could afford to employ all these young men to stand around wearing white gloves and serving soup, you were obviously, doing very well indeed. So it's one of those sort of unintended consequences kind of situation. That's why everybody's so excited to get a new man servant around the house, because it just does make them look so good. Basket on her arm, Sarah was out of the fug and fluster of the kitchen and into the autumn cool. She dawdled past the stable door. Dust motes hung in the air, along with the limey smell of whitewash. The top half of the door was open. Inside it looked warm. She got a glimpse of the chestnut mare's glossy flank and the sun shafting through a high window. Of the new manservant, still no sign. Every step she took was as slow as a step could possibly be, and still he did not come out. The ladder had been left against the pippin tree. Head and shoulders amongst the leaves, she stretched out for the heavy, blushed fruit, taking whatever was within easiest reach with little thought to size or ripeness. As soon as she'd filled the trug, she scrambled straight back down the ladder, skirts gathered. She hurried up to the house, the basket handle hooked over her folded arms. The apples might bruise a little, knocking about like that, but they'd hardly have time to spoil. As she strode along the side of the stable block, the basket bumping against her thighs, feeling bright with possibility, the new manservant was at the same moment striding along the front of the stables, pushing a heavily laden wheelbarrow before him. The two met as they swung round the corner from opposite directions. The edge of the wheelbarrow hacked into Sarah's shin. She grabbed at her basket. He stumbled to a halt, clutching at the barrow handles. They stood face to face. She was wide-eyed, lips parted. He was a mess of loosened hair. The barrow load of ripened, stinking stable muck steamed faintly in the autumn cool between them. So romantic. Sorry, she said. I always do that. I don't know if that's the thing. Do you do that, where you apologize when someone bumps into you? But Sarah does that too. Sorry, she said. He pulled the barrow back, then pushed the hair out of his eyes. His skin was the colour of tea. His eyes were light hazel and caught the sun. He peered down at her skirts where he'd hit her. Does it hurt? She bit her lip, shook her head. It really did. I didn't see you. You should be more careful. She could feel the trickle of heat where her shin bled. It nearly dropped my apples. Oh, yes, he said. I see that. Apples. Yes, well, you should really... So if you're all right, he jerked his head, kitchen garden down this way. She nodded. He wheeled the barrow back another step and swerved past her. Right then. Thanks. Then he was away, rattling down the track and round the bend, his waistcoat hanging loose around him, breeches gathered in at his middle like a flour sack, one boot sole flapping half off. So this was the fine, upstanding young man. This was the great addition to the household. As far as Sarah could see, he was no great addition to anything at all. And a good afternoon to you too, she yelled after him. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it there because things have got off to a bad start for Sarah and James, and they can't progress easily, really, or smoothly from that point. But if you've read it already, you already know that. And if you haven't read it already, I don't want to give too many spoilers. And if you're 10 pages in, then, well, you won't have reached that point yet even. But I will leave it there, and I will do my best if you want to ask me a question. I will do my best to answer it, but I can't make any promises. But thank you very much. Thank you. Or not. If you don't have questions, that's also fine.
If you have a question, just raise your hand and we will come to you with a microphone. We have one up here. I'm just curious, in Pride and Prejudice, was there a James character, a manservant?
There's a manservant mentioned, and I can't even really say any more about it's only that. I tried in a very early draft to not name any characters that Austen doesn't give a name, and it got so messy. So I decided I had to start naming people, even though she doesn't give them a name. For example, Mr. Hill in my book, there is no Mr. Hill in Pride and Prejudice, but there is a butler. And I was rewatching for probably about the 8th time, Joe Wright's version of Pride and Prejudice, you know, the Matthew McFadden one. And they make the same decision that Butler is also called Mr. Hill, because that kind of thing's not unusual. So yes, there is a figure, but he's a very ghostly figure.
Note.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just scanned your author's note, and I'm so glad I did. And I would suggest others might do that in the back of the book.
I'll do that too.
Before they even read it. I think it would help.
Okay.
Do you think that?
Yeah, it wouldn't do any harm. I don't think it gives too much away, does it? Yeah, it actually would make quite a nice little preface, wouldn't it? As opposed to like a...
I'm glad I did it. I'll read it more thoroughly.
Yeah. Do you know that we actually, I remember now you mentioned that, we had a big discussion about where that piece of text should go. And my publishers insisted that it go at the back, because I was we're talking about this, I remember, I was writing it with the thought that it might go at the front. And they said, no, you just put it at the back, because if you put it at the front, people are going to feel that you're apologizing, or, you know, you're being defensive. So it was put at the back as a kind of afterword instead. Okay.
Hi. Did you have to get permission from anyone to do kind of a spin-off or a book?
It's out of copyright now. In the UK, it's the 75-year rule. So this is why there's things like Pride and Prejudice and zombies and stuff like that. People, you know, can take their scissors to it. But I think with anything more recent, you would struggle.
Anything in the U.S. after 1923, I believe, is still protected, but anything before 1923 is not.
That's useful. Thank you. Learn something. The lady just asked why I became a writer. Sorry, I've been trained to repeat questions if they're done without a microphone. I just am one. It's one of those things, you can either do it or not do it, but if it's in you, you're a writer who isn't writing, or you're a writer who is writing, but you're still a writer even if you're not doing it, if you know what I mean. And it's just, as a child, I would make little books, and, you know, I paused for a bit while I was a student, and was studying so many great writers, it knocked all the stuffing out of me. I'm glad I did that now, but it took me a while to sort of bed that down and gain any sense of myself as a writer.
In your research on servants, did you run across Pamela Cox in her BBC series? Have you ever heard of that?
There was a BBC series I remember watching. I can't remember who was fronting it, though.
Oh, did you watch the BBC series?
Is it quite recent?
I think it was last year.
Yeah, then I did, yeah.
It was a history of servants.
Yeah.
It was like
three
shows.
Yeah, and some of it sort of ends up relatively recent, doesn't
yes.
it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it good? Because I haven't seen it. I've just it's a documentary.
Yeah.
About the history of British servants.
Yeah. Which for me is absolutely fascinating. Yes.
Yeah, I would.
I did enjoy it, but again, it's one of those things I watched slightly like that because I was worried that there would be stuff that I'd got badly wrong.
Okay. Thank you.
These things are always terrifying. It's like when I heard Amanda Vickery was reading the book, I was appalled, but it turned out okay. But yes, it's worth seeing if you can, yeah. So I think there's a lady, someone at the back there. Oh, gentleman, yes, hello.
I'm not a lady, though.
No, sorry, I saw a lady behind you. I thought she'd been given the microphone.
We were delayed, so I apologize in advance. We were delayed. So if you covered this, that covers my apology.
Okay.
I wanted to ask a question about the mechanics of the writing, if you can use that word, because it isn't mechanical and it's different, I'm supposed, with each writer and each author. Because you have a 330-page novel. You also mentioned the fact that your son commented, so obviously you have a son to attend to, and other things that take your interest. How long does it take you to, or did it take you to write 331 pages doing the research that you did, finding the time to do it, just those kind of space making and mechanical type things, please.
Yeah, sure. I think it sort of comes back to what I was saying earlier about if you're a writer, you write, whether or not, you need to find the time to do it. I go a bit crazy if I'm not writing. So it's important for me to be writing. And so that makes it easy for me to decide that I'm going to give it some time. I used to have a full-time job as well as being a mum and a writer. And then I used to write at night and just not sleep very much. So I'd wake up at 3 and work till 7 and then get the kids up to school. I've got 2 kids. Nowadays, I work when the kids are at school. And I tend to give the rest of my time to family as much as possible. Apart from when I'm off doing wonderful things like this, I try to be as available, totally available, while I'm not totally doing something else. And that's, I think, the only way to do it, for me anyway. Just to compartmentalize. So the house might be in chaos, but I will walk away from it and work for hours, and then come back and think, oh God, the house is in chaos, and then start, on that kind of side of things. But I think compartmentalizing and just getting words down, or getting them edited, or whatever phase you're in. The research just went on for, I think the interesting thing about historical research is the layers of it. So I'd have been reading stuff about Austen and about the Georgian period for years, just because I'm interested. And then it sort of the focus narrowed during the process of writing, because I worked out what I needed to know. And then at the very end of the process, I would realize that there were some gaps, and I would go back and try and find things to fill it. So there's a kind of layered quality to the research as well. So actually in terms of the actual writing, the mechanical phase of the writing, 2 years to write this book. And I sped up massively towards the end, because someone pointed out to me that in 2013, so November 2012, my husband said to me, you do know the 200th anniversary of Pride and Prejudice is coming up next year. And apparently he'd known for a while and was too scared to tell me. Because I didn't know. And I just put my head in my hands and wailed. So, and then I just got it done by January. We had it out to publishers. Because I kind of figured, if you get it out on the 200th anniversary, that's one thing. If you get it out the following year, it's a bit of a damp squib,
Just a short follow-up question, please. I carry a romantic concept of Dylan Thomas going to a cabin by the sea and doing his writing there. I suppose a lot of authors and writers have that kind of wherewithal and location and so forth. Do you have a writing spot? Is that someplace in your home?
I have a little corner of a cafe in the town where I live, where they're prepared to let me sit for hours on end with 1 cup of coffee. I aspire to the cabin by the sea. In fact, what I'd really love to do is get a little sort of gypsy caravan for the corner of the garden. I was in one recently, just playing in one at a garden centre with my daughter, and I thought, oh, I want one of these. But I haven't. We'd have to, can't afford to do that yet, but that would be lovely. Yeah, lots of writers do have a shed in the garden thing. Roald Dahl, one.
I wondered, since you've done so much research on this period, are you going to do another similar thing for a different Jane Austen novel? No, or for another novelist?
Maybe at some point in the future, but right now, no. I'm into something else completely, and sort of, in the thick of something else. So that just, I'm afraid I've got a bit of a butterfly mind. I just wanted to be on to something else. No. Right. Yes, yeah. But funnily enough, people have been asking me, would I write a sequel to this? And I think that story's told. And then someone said, what about Ptolemy? What did Ptolemy get up to in the end? And I thought, ooh, the further adventures of Ptolemy Bingley. But I've no plans immediately. Hello.
Hello. I haven't read the book yet. I'm looking forward to it. And your talk tonight is really interesting. As an American, I'm always puzzled by the English class structure, particularly in the Georgian period. And I'm wondering, there would have been a difference between the household at Bennett's and Mr. Darcy's great house. But
Yes.
I take it your book doesn't go on to Mr. Darcy's because you're centered on the Bennetts?
Well,
Or is it kind of?
spoilers.
I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I am very interested in that, the class structure and the class system. And it does, the book does consider the different households and their different ways of working. Amongst other things, one thing that fascinates me is the levels of formality in terms of the relationships between servants and employers in these different households. The low, if we can, I don't even like these terms low and high, partly because I come from low. But this notion that, you know, if you're working in a poorer household, you as the female, as the sort of the wife, would be working alongside your maid, your solitary maid, and you'd be doing the linen together, and you'd be cooking together, and all the stuff together. By the time you get to someone, you know, something like Pemberley, you might not even make eye contact. I'm not saying that Mr. Darcy's a bad man or anything like that, but just something of that standing. You've got separate corridors, you know, people would behave in very strange, what seems to me to be very strange ways. You know, be doing quite intimate and personal things in front of servants as if they weren't there or weren't human. And I remember talking about this book in a very wealthy village, in a literary festival, a little town in the south of England. And I made some comment about this. And the gentleman put up his hand and said, "But if you didn't ignore your servants, you'd get no privacy." And I just thought, okay, so yeah, that's the kind of people I'm talking to here. And it's just a bit different, you know.
Just a quick follow-up. Do we know how Mr. Bennett made his money?
Mr. Bennett?
Yeah.
Well, he'll have inherited Longbourn, and that will have come with a certain amount of farmland. They're farmers, amongst other things, and he probably will have inherited a small amount of money. Right. But it's, as we know, entailed to the next male.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Would you please pull your little micro shoulder over?
Sorry.
Thank you.
It's tricky. I'm not really dressed for this. Is that any better? Yes.
Would you tell us a bit, please, about your other works?
Ooh, well, sorry, excuse me, I'm just getting more water. I can tell you that they're all being reissued in paperback. Issued in paperback here in America. Only one of mine has previously been published here. And the one that's been previously published here is called The Undertow. And it's about a family in London, ordinary working-class family going through the 20th century, effectively, from Gallipoli to 7/7, which was the bombings on the Underground in 2007. And it's really about family and war. And the ones in between, the ones that came before that, the ones that are being reissued, I tend, as I said, I have a bit of a butterfly mind, and so there's some very different books there. My first one's set in Belfast, which is where I was living at the time, and it's about that sort of post-ceasefire, the post-Troubles period, when everything is very much in flux. And about a sort of a person changing and a city changing. The one after that is called The Mermaid's Child, and it's a kind of slightly sort of fantastical, picaresque story in which a young person's looking for their mother. And then the one after that is called The Telling. It'll be out, I don't know when, it's going to be a little while before it comes out here. And that's about, it's a ghost story and it's a love story, and it's set during, at least in part, it's set during the Chartist rebellion in Britain, which was attempt, the move towards democracy that was current in the 1830s through to the 1840s and got snuffed out around then. Is that okay? It's not too much detail. I think we'll remember as well. Some of that's a long time ago now.
I think we'll take just one more. So it's almost 7:30, and we want to make sure that everyone can get a book signed.
It's a good one.
Yeah, I hate to be the last one. I feel like I should have a really profound question.
No, please, no.
And I don't.
Really light would be nice.
I'm just wondering if as she was talking about the class society thing, the differences, is that still going on? And if so, is it the same or has it evolved?
But you know, my niece is actually in service now, which I find really strange. And that was a deliberate decision. She works as a housekeeper. I mean, it has changed. I mean, one thing about this period is it's just at the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So there isn't really what we would call, or what we would call at home, the working class yet. It's just beginning. The factory system is just beginning. And well, there are pockets of it, like in the north, because you've got things like the Luddite riots are about, happening at the same time as Pride and Prejudice happens, which is when a bunch of people get made redundant because of change in technology, and they riot. They have no bread, they have no political representation, and these are the men as well. So they, it's them that have got put out of work. Sorry, getting distracted by historical detail there, but so to some degree, greater or lesser extent, Britain's still run by the Norman conquerors. It's still the same people, with exceptions. It's inherited, it continues to be inherited. Privilege exists in a really stratified way, in my opinion. So at the moment, our government is made up of basically boys who went to Eton and Oxford, or Oxbridge, and were members of what was called the Bullingdon Club, which was a drinking club. And so, and they just sort things out for their friends, and that's still how it works. But it's all getting a bit political now. So but in terms of opportunities for people who come from below, for a long time, well, for the 20th century, that was much better. I think things are closing down now, because we had those wonderful things like, the welfare state and free education at university level, and that meant that there was a great deal more flexibility at that period. But I think it's turning rock hard again, though things have got sort of muddled up a bit in the meantime. But as I said, that's a bit political. My pleasure.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we're going to take. We have books for sale out there. If you have not purchased a book yet, they are paperback copies for $17.50. That includes your tax and everything like that. We just rounded it up to a nice number. And Joe will be signing them out there.
And if you have a burning question you haven't asked me, I'm more than happy to try and answer it as well.
Yes, so I'm going to trust that all of you can form an orderly line. And I'm not going to dismiss you by row or anything like that. So, but please don't trample Jo as she makes her way out there.
Thank you.